I was standing under fluorescent lights that hummed too loudly, holding a small memory device in my palm while someone tried to convince a courtroom I had stolen a mother from her own child. My heart was steady, but my hands were cold, and I could feel the weight of years pressing down on that single moment. The air smelled like paper and disinfectant, and everything felt unreal. If you've ever been blamed for protecting someone you love, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Stories like this happen more often than people admit. As accusations piled up in silence, I knew the truth sat quietly with me, patient and undeniable. What they didn't know was that this story didn't start in that courtroom, or with money, or even with betrayal. It started on a dark night, at my front door, with a child who carried everything he owned in one small bag. That was the moment everything truly began. I was standing in a courtroom that felt too clean for the accusation in the air. The claim was that I had poisoned my grandson against his mother, that I had twisted a boy's heart for gain. The demand followed quickly in my mind. She wanted half of what he had built, as if love could be divided like an account balance. I kept my face still. Inside, outrage burned, steady and controlled. I had raised students long enough to know when truth was bent to serve a story. This was one of those moments. I listened, breathing through the weight of it, and felt the room press closer, waiting for me to flinch. I didn't. I rested my hand on a small memory device I had brought, light enough to disappear in a pocket, heavy enough to carry years. I did not explain it. I did not need to. I knew what it held, and I knew what it would undo. What they were saying was backwards. Every word. The harm did not start with me, and the money was never the point. The real story was quieter and older than this room. To understand why I stood there so calm, you have to go back with me, to the night my grandson was left at my door alone. I remember the knock coming late, well after 10 o'clock, when the house had already settled into its quiet. The porch light cut through the dark, and there he stood with a small suitcase and a backpack that looked too heavy for his shoulders. His mother didn't come inside. I felt it immediately, that subtle wrongness you feel before your mind catches up. He stepped in carefully, like he didn't want to take up space. He kept his eyes low, jaw tight, holding himself together with the kind of control children shouldn't need. I noticed how clean his clothes were, how deliberately packed his bag looked, like this wasn't rushed. That realization sat cold in my chest. I made tea out of habit, not because either of us drank it. I watched him sit at the table, hands folded, waiting. He didn't ask questions. He didn't cry. That scared me more than anything. Silence like that doesn't belong to a temporary visit. As the minutes passed, the truth settled in quietly. No follow-up call. No explanation. No sense of urgency. Just absence. I understood then that he hadn't been dropped off for a night or a weekend. He had been left later, after he fell asleep on the couch, still dressed. I stood in the hallway listening to his breathing. It was steady, practiced, like someone used to being strong when no one was watching. I felt responsibility shift without ceremony. Something had changed, and there was no asking permission. When the house finally went still again, I found the envelope tucked into his bag. Papers, signatures, answers I wasn't ready for, waiting for me to open them. I stood there longer than I should have, knowing sleep would not come, knowing morning would demand decisions, and understanding that whatever those papers said, my life and his were already bound together from that moment forward without hesitation or retreat, ever. The house was completely still by the time I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope open in front of me. The clock read after midnight, and every sound felt louder than it should have. I spread the papers out slowly, as if moving too fast might make the truth hit harder. The first pages made my stomach drop. This wasn't temporary guardianship. It wasn't a short-term arrangement or a safety plan. The language was clear and final. Custody had been signed over in full, quietly, with intent. My grandson hadn't been dropped off. He had been legally erased from his mother's daily life in a single stroke of ink. I kept reading, my chest tightening with every page. Then I reached the financial documents, records tied to a trust set up in his name years earlier, something meant to protect his future. The numbers didn't line up. Withdrawals that had nothing to do with his care. Transfers that pointed away from him, not toward him. It was careful, organized, not desperate. That was the moment my sadness hardened into something else. This wasn't a parent overwhelmed and out of options. This was someone making a calculated exit, making sure money moved before responsibility disappeared. The abandonment had been planned, and the paperwork was the proof. I sat there longer than I can say, hands flat on the table, feeling the weight of what had been done to him without his consent. Whatever softness I still had about the situation shifted into resolve. Protecting him was no longer emotional. It was necessary. As I gathered the papers back into a stack, one thought kept returning, unsettling and persistent. Some of the details felt too familiar, too expected. And that was when it occurred to me that he might already know more about this than I had just learned myself. Morning came softly, almost politely, like the house was trying not to wake what had broken the night before. He was already up when I walked into the kitchen, sitting straight, backpack beside him, calm in a way that didn't fit his age. I watched him move through the morning with intention. He ate, cleaned his plate, waited. No questions, no confusion. It was the stillness of someone who had already accepted an outcome. As the hours passed, pieces began to surface through his behavior and the way his eyes lingered when paperwork was nearby. He wasn't guessing. He knew there was money set aside for him, a trust meant to follow him into adulthood. More than that, he understood it hadn't been used the way it should have been. That awareness sat heavy between us, unspoken but unmistakable. Inside, I reeled. I had spent the night uncovering betrayal, believing I was protecting a child from truths he couldn't carry. Instead, I was standing beside someone who had been quietly collecting those truths on his own. He had been listening to adults talk when they thought he wasn't paying attention. He had been noticing patterns, remembering dates, holding details in his head without showing fear. What struck me most wasn't anger. It was respect. This wasn't a passive victim waiting to be saved. This was a boy who had learned to survive by staying observant and prepared. In that moment, I understood something fundamental had shifted. Love and shelter were no longer enough. What he needed now was protection alone. I made the call the next morning, not out of anger, but clarity. Love had brought him into my home, but love alone would not protect him from what had already started. I needed the law on his side. The attorney's office was quiet, neutral, steady. She listened, reviewed the papers, and moved with the confidence of someone who had seen this kind of damage before. Temporary guardianship came first, a formal acknowledgement that the child sleeping in my spare room was my responsibility now, in every way that mattered. Signing my name felt heavier than I expected. It wasn't fear. It was the understanding that I was stepping fully into a role that had no exit plan. I wasn't rescuing him for a season. I was committing to his future. The filings went through. School records were updated. Doctors' offices stopped asking questions. Small things shifted, but together they formed something solid, a life with structure again. The reaction from his mother came quickly, sharp and hostile even from a distance. Threats hovered at the edges, implied more than stated. I noted them, filed them away, and stayed focused. Stability was the priority, not response. With guardianship secured, the days began to settle. Mornings found rhythm. Homework replaced anxiety. Silence became peaceful instead of tense. Time started moving forward again, quietly giving us space to grow and prepare for whatever might come next without fear, without apology or hesitation. The years that followed didn't rush past us. They settled in, one routine at a time. Mornings became predictable. School calendars filled the fridge. The tension that once lived in the house slowly loosened its grip, replaced by something steadier and quieter. I watched him grow into himself. His grades improved, not dramatically, but consistently. More important, his shoulders relaxed. He laughed more easily. He slept through the night. Stability gave him room to focus, and he used it well. I started noticing the late nights first, a light still on when the rest of the house was dark. Not reckless, not distracted, just focused. He worked with patience, teaching himself things most kids his age never thought about. He didn't brag. He didn't ask for praise. He just kept going. There were small wins along the way. School competitions, projects that earned attention, a teacher who paused a little longer at conferences, impressed but careful. Then, eventually, someone outside the family took notice. Not flashy, just recognition that what he was building mattered. What stayed with me most was his discipline. He documented everything: dates, progress, decisions. Not out of fear, but habit. A quiet instinct to keep record, to leave nothing vague or forgotten. It felt deliberate, like preparation without panic. Our life stayed simple. We cooked dinner together. We argued about curfews. We planned for college without urgency. Underneath it all, though, something was taking shape. He was building more than skill. He was building independence. By the time I realized how far he had come, the groundwork was already laid. The routines, the records, the patience, all of it had been leading somewhere. And then one opportunity arrived, unexpected and undeniable. And I understood that the quiet years were over. Everything he had been preparing for was finally about to step into the light. The breakthrough didn't arrive with noise. It came quietly. One ordinary afternoon, when he sat at the table and showed me what years of discipline had produced, I felt pride first, then disbelief, then a slow awareness that our lives had just shifted. The scale of it took time to sink in. This wasn't a small win or a lucky break. It was security, independence, the kind of success that changes how the world looks at you. I watched him absorb it without celebration, without urgency. He stayed careful, measured, exactly the way he had always been. What surprised me most was how little he let it change him. He kept the same routines. He still asked before making decisions. When he spoke about money, it was with intention, not excitement. He made a point of sharing, not to show generosity, but to make sure I was protected too. That gesture told me more than any number ever could. Inside the house, the air felt different, safer, but also exposed. Success has a way of lifting curtains you didn't know were there. It changes power, even when you don't ask it to. I was proud beyond words, but a quiet unease settled beside that pride. I had seen enough to know that visibility invites attention. People who once walked away tend to notice when something valuable appears. I sensed the past had noticed, and that someone would soon return again. I knew the moment I saw her again that nothing good had followed her back into our lives. Years had passed without a word, and suddenly she stood there with confidence she hadn't earned. Timing her return just after success made my grandson visible. Her tone was softer than I remembered, careful, almost rehearsed. She spoke with the posture of someone who believed the past could be rewritten if presented gently enough. I felt the old alarm rise in me, the same instinct that had warned me the night she left him behind. What unsettled me most was the contrast. The woman who once disappeared without explanation now carried herself as if absence were a misunderstanding, as if time alone had absolved everything. She framed her interest as concern, her curiosity as care, but her attention never stayed on him for long. It drifted instead toward what he had built. The shift came quickly. Warmth thinned into expectation. Expectation hardened into entitlement. The conversation turned toward money, toward what she believed she deserved for giving him life, as if biology were a contract that accrued interest. Then came the threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. Legal action, public claims, a promise to take what she felt owed, regardless of the cost. Any remaining doubt burned away in that moment. This was not about reconciliation or regret. This was about control. When she finally left, the house felt smaller, heavier. We didn't argue or panic. We sat together in silence, already understanding that words would not protect us. Only preparation would. After she left, I expected fear to surface. I braced myself to comfort him, to reassure him that threats were just noise. Instead, I found calm. He wasn't shaken. He was steady in a way that stopped me cold. As we sat there, I realized this wasn't new territory for him. The anger, the entitlement, the sudden interest in money, none of it surprised him. He had anticipated it. Over the years, while life seemed ordinary, he had been quietly preserving details, dates, messages, patterns, not obsessively, not emotionally, but methodically. That was when the small memory device I had carried for so long took on new meaning. It wasn't just mine. It was part of something larger he had been building, a record meant to protect himself long before success made him visible again. Inside me, something shifted. I had spent years standing in front of him, shielding him from harm. Now I understood that he had been standing beside me all along, prepared in his own way. Trust replaced instinctive protection. Respect settled where fear might have been. There was no celebration in that moment, just clarity. The balance had changed, quietly. We were no longer reacting to threats. We were ready to answer them. The next step wouldn't be personal or emotional. It would be formal, documented, and final. And it would unfold where truth carries weight. Then, the courtroom felt different this time. Smaller, quieter, stripped of the drama I had imagined during all the waiting. I noticed my breathing first, steady but deliberate, and the way my shoulders finally relaxed once I realized we were ready. There was no performance, no raised voices, just records laid out with care, timelines that aligned, and patterns that spoke for themselves. Years of preparation surfaced gently, one piece at a time. I felt the shift before it was acknowledged, that subtle moment when certainty replaces accusation. What surprised me was how quickly the narrative unraveled. Claims that once sounded threatening lost their shape when held up against documented truth. Manipulation doesn't survive light for long. It doesn't argue back. It simply collapses. I watched the tension drain from my grandson's posture, almost imperceptibly. Not relief exactly, but confirmation. He had trusted the process, trusted patience, trusted that facts would speak louder than history rewritten in anger. Inside me, Something loosened that I hadn't realized I was still carrying. The fight, as it turned out, had ended not with a victory, but with clarity. No one needed to be punished for justice to be served. The truth was enough. When it was over, there was no urge to linger. We walked out into the daylight with the quiet understanding that this chapter had closed. The threat was gone. What remained was space. Space to breathe, space to heal, and space to finally see what life might look like without the shadow of conflict following us forward into whatever came next. The days after everything ended felt strangely quiet. Not empty, just softer. The kind of quiet that settles in after a storm passes and leaves you listening to what's still standing. There were no more messages, no sudden appearances, no new threats dressed up as concern. She withdrew completely, as if the moment truth took shape. There was nothing left for her to reach for. That absence brought relief, but it also carried a weight. Closure isn't loud, it's subtle, and sometimes it hurts in places you didn't expect. Life resumed its rhythm. Appointments became routine again. Evenings returned to normal conversations and shared meals. We laughed more easily, but there were moments when silence lingered just a second too long, reminding us that surviving something doesn't mean it leaves no mark. I thought often about what we had gained and what we had lost. Security, clarity, and peace came at the cost of illusions. Some relationships cannot be repaired, only understood and set down carefully. Boundaries replaced hope, and acceptance took the place of questions that would never have answers. What mattered most was watching him move forward, unburdened. He didn't dwell on what had been taken from him. He focused on what he could build next. That choice told me more about healing than any legal resolution ever could. Justice didn't erase the past, but it gave us room to breathe again. And in that space, something steady began to grow, a future shaped not by conflict, but by intention. By the time I noticed it, my heart had already begun to rest, ready to look back not with anger, but with meaning. When I look back now, what stays with me isn't the courtroom or the paperwork. It's the quiet moments in between, the ones where love showed up not because it had to, but because it chose to. That's what carried us through. Not biology, not obligation, choice. I learned that family isn't defined by who gives you life, but by who stands with you when life turns hard. Boundaries aren't punishment, they're protection. And resilience isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's just getting up each day and deciding to move forward anyway. Watching my grandson grow into himself taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means understanding what deserves space in your life and what doesn't. We didn't erase the past. We learned from it. And in doing so, we built something steadier than what we lost. If you've stayed with me through this story, thank you. Truly. Sharing something this personal isn't easy, but stories like these matter because they remind us we're not alone in the complicated parts of loving others. If you've ever had to choose someone, protect someone, or set a boundary that hurt even though it was right, I'd love to hear from you. Have you lived through something similar or learned a hard lesson about family and resilience? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone.